Boomers are not as rich as many people think they are, and many of them are retiring broke. In fact, 43% of people aged 55 to 64 have absolutely nothing saved for retirement. And for those that do have money saved, the numbers are shockingly low. The median boomer has a net worth of $387,000. And that number isn't liquid money sitting in a vault, but it's spread out between their homes, retirement accounts, and other small assets, giving them little actual income in retirement. And because of that, 53% of retirees rely on Social Security as their main source of income. Which is so bizarre because this is the generation that supposedly had it all. Decades of economic expansion, an affordable housing market, and a booming stock market. But the truth is, most of these advantages are really just an illusion, or only really benefited a small percentage of boomers. And in this video, I want to talk about why the wealthiest generation ended up retiring broke. And quick thanks to FSA Store for sponsoring this video, but more on that later. And so understanding why starts off with seeing boomer wealth for what it actually is. Chapter 1, the wealth distribution of boomers. Now, the baby boomer generation is the wealthiest generation in history. I mean, despite just being 20% of the population, they hold over 51% of US household wealth. However, this is a very misleading statistic because it can make you quickly come to the conclusion the boomer generation is wealthy, so all boomers are wealthy. But saying that is sort of like saying America is a wealthy country, so all Americans are wealthy. And we all know that's not true. Wealth is often highly unequally distributed. I mean, when it comes to American wealth, the top 10% of Americans hold more wealth than the bottom 90%. And when it comes to boomer wealth, this is actually even more unequal, because while the top 10% of Americans hold 67% of the nation's wealth, the top 10% of boomers hold 71% of the boomers' wealth. The reality of boomer wealth is that most of it is concentrated upwards, and the broad population isn't seeing that much of it, because while the top 10% hold 71% of the wealth, the other 90% are left to split the remaining 29%. And so now that we understand that, the next question is, what does the typical boomer actually have? Chapter 2, the median boomer. Now, the problem with the all boomers are rich argument is that it focuses on average. The average boomer has a net worth of $1.6 million. But averages are often very misleading because if you have 10 people in a room and 9 of them have no money but one has $10 million, then the average person has $1 million. But in reality, 9 out of 10 of them are broke. And that is exactly what is happening with the boomers' wealth. A small percentage of wealthy boomers are pushing up the average. And so in order to get a better understanding of what the typical boomer actually has, we need to look at the median, or the typical boomer. And when you look at the median, the picture really changes. According to Federal Reserve data, the median boomer has a net worth of $387,000, which is about $1.2 million difference from the average. Which is a pretty big difference. However, even that number can be very misleading because net worth does not equal usable money. And most of the wealth that the typical boomer has is not all that usable. It's not money sitting in a vault, but it's tied up in their homes, retirement accounts, and other assets that don't produce much of an income. For most retired boomers, money is very tight, and so they need to make sure they're stretching every single dollar they have. But this isn't just a boomer problem. In today's economy, everyone needs to make sure they're stretching their dollar as far as possible. And one huge mistake that causes people to waste a lot of money is not taking advantage of benefits that people already have, which is why I'm excited to talk about FSA Store, who is the sponsor of today's video. Did you know that if you have a flexible spending account, or FSA, you can use your pre-tax money not just on doctor's appointments and prescriptions, but on everyday items like sunscreen and Tylenol, allowing you to save money on things that you're already buying? FSA Store is the largest online marketplace dedicated to FSA-eligible products with over 2,500 eligible items. And they have everything, to Burt's Bees lip balm, to designer prescription sunglasses, to tampons, to Benadryl, to a pain-relieving massage gun. All of these items are qualified medical expenses that you can use your pre-tax dollars to buy and save a lot of money. An FSA store sent me a few items to try. I got these electrolyte packets, sunscreen, Band-Aids, and eczema lotion. And so if you have a flexible spending account, give FSA Store a look by scanning this QR code or going to fsastore.com/AustinW. Using that link or scanning that code not only supports this channel as it lets them know I sent you, but more importantly, it allows you to make sure that you're getting the most out of your pre-tax dollars. And thank you FSA Store for sponsoring this video. Alright, so as we've uncovered, the median boomer has a net worth just under $400,000. The next thing that we're going to do is break that number down to understand why it doesn't go far in retirement. Chapter 3, The Problem with Boomer Wealth. Now, to understand why just under $400,000 isn't doing that much for them in retirement, let's break down the boomer's net worth and see what it actually does for them in retirement, starting with their biggest asset, their homes. Almost 80% of boomers are homeowners, pushing up their net worth. Most of boomer wealth is in their homes. However, the problem with home wealth is that it isn't liquid. You can't withdraw a percentage of your home to use it to fund retirement. And even if you sell it, you still need to live somewhere in the same housing market. And so the largest percentage of boomer wealth is actually unusable. And to make matters worse, their biggest asset is often also their biggest liability. Because even if you have a paid off home, you still have to pay property taxes, maintenance, repairs, and insurance, which could leave you with a surprise expense on your already limited income. The next largest percentage of boomer wealth is in their retirement accounts. And the median boomer has a retirement account balance of between $100,000 to $200,000. Which might sound like a decent amount of money, but it's important to remember that that amount has to last them 20 to 30 years. And so that amount is only bringing in an income of around $300 to $700 a month under the 4% rule. Although they have $100,000 to $200,000, that money isn't actually producing much of an income because they have to stretch it out over such a long period of time. And the final portion of boomer wealth is in much smaller assets, like their limited savings accounts that they don't want to use and cars that depreciate in value. The reality is, although the typical boomer has a net worth of over $300,000, most of that wealth isn't that usable in their day-to-day retirement. And so the next question is, how did this happen? How did such a large percentage of boomers end up with so little wealth? Well, the answer to that question starts with understanding the two distinct economic realities that boomers live through. Chapter 4, The Generational Divide. Now, although the boomers are just one generation, that generation spans an 18-year period. And depending on where you were born in that period, drastically shape your financial outcomes. And so in order to understand that, we have to divide the generation into two groups, the early boomers and the late boomers. These two subgroups started adulthood with completely different economic realities. First, the early boomers. They grew up in the post-war economic boom and started their careers when jobs were stable and long-term. And that stability gave them an early start to building wealth. In the 1960s, one income could buy a home, which meant early boomers started to build equity in their early 20s. And in addition, because they started their careers when jobs were stable and long-term, many of them had access to pensions, which guaranteed them income in retirement. The first wave of boomers had a clear advantage when it came to building wealth and preparing for retirement, but that advantage wouldn't last for the entire generation. The second group, or the late boomers, experienced a very different economic reality. They came of age during a cultural revolution and entered adulthood in one of the worst economies since the Great Depression, when unemployment was high, inflation was high, and America was losing global dominance. Things were starting to get less stable as they were becoming adults, and building wealth was much harder than it was before. For example, back in the 80s when they started their careers, home ownership was difficult because interest rates were at an all-time high of 18%, making it harder to start building equity early on. And in addition, as late boomers were entering the workforce, many companies started to phase out their pension plans. So most late boomers never got access to a pension. These two subgroups experienced completely different starts to adulthood. However, once they entered the 80s, both of these groups would experience a major shift to the retirement system. Chapter 5, the 401k shift. When many boomers were born, many expected that they would follow the same path as their parents, get a stable job, contribute to a pension plan, and retire at 65 off Social Security and a pension. But once we moved towards the 1980s, it was clear that that path was disappearing. Corporate America was shifting away from company pension plans to individual 401k plans. And for these two subgroups, the shift impacted them differently. For the early boomers, many of them had already been working for 10 to 15 years building a pension plan. But once 401k started to be the standard, many of their pension plans were frozen, meaning by retirement they would get less than they expected and had to cover the rest with their own 401ks. And for late boomers, many of them whom started work in the late 70s and early 80s never even had access to a pension plan, meaning they were on their own from day one without direction. Both of these subgroups were caught up in the middle of a changing retirement system, a shift that was so big that no generation since has ever seen. And they not only lost the retirement plan they expected, but they now had to decide how much to save, learn to invest, and take on the risk themselves, and very few people knew what to do. And it didn't help that the previous 15 years, the stock market that they were told would bring them to retirement went nowhere, making it hard to 1, trust the new system, and 2, gain momentum. And just as many of them were starting to understand the system, it all fell apart. Chapter 6, the midlife crisis. Now, despite these two different starts in the shift to the 401k, once this generation entered their 40s and 50s, they were looking more stable. They had built careers, bought homes, and were growing their retirement accounts. But as they were fully in their peak responsibility and their peak earning years, an event would happen that would impact the rest of their adulthood, the 2008 financial crisis, where millions lost their home, retirement accounts plummeted, and home values fell. And every generation got hit by the recession in a different way. But for boomers, it hit them at a critical moment because they were at the point in their lives where they had the most to lose, were at the height of their responsibility, and there wasn't that much time to recover. And it impacted the two subgroups differently. For early boomers, they were between 53 and 62, so the final stretch before retirement, which was a terrible moment for this to happen because they didn't have the time to wait for the market to recover, and so many had to keep working and delay retirement. On the other hand, late boomers were between the ages of 44 and 52, and this crisis was just as terrible for them because many of them were loaded with responsibilities, and a job loss could potentially wipe out everything they built prior, and because of that, many are now entering retirement age with very little. So many boomers were forced to sell investments at a loss, and they were never able to recover from it. One moment can wipe out 20 years of previous prosperity, which is what happened to many boomers. And so what did they do next? Well, they kept working. But since the recession, work was never the same. Chapter 7, the lost decades of work. As the economy was starting to recover by the early 2010s, boomers were entering the final stretch of their careers between the ages of 46 to 64. In an ideal world, this is the phase of life where your hard work finally starts paying off, as your wealth is really starting to compound and your career is established. But many boomers didn't live in an ideal world. They entered these years with very little wealth and were starting over. And the world that they returned to after the recession made it even harder on them because not only was it an extremely tough job market, but because they were at the tail end of their careers, they were less desirable, more likely to be targeted for layoffs, and opportunities became more limited. And so after so many boomers lost everything during the recession, many of them were forced into low-paying jobs for the rest of their working lives just to stay afloat, not only making the present harder, but making the future more uncertain as retirement planning became harder. They're too old to hire, but too young to retire. And because of that, many boomers are just getting forced to retire early. And because of that, their retirement is ultimately boiled down to one thing. Chapter 8, Why Social Security Isn't Enough. As I said in the beginning of this video, 53% of retirees rely on Social Security as their main source of income. Which is a big problem because Social Security was never meant to fully fund retirement. It was supposed to be one leg of a three-legged stool, along with pensions, which few actually got, and personal savings, which is very little. I mean, based on what we've uncovered in this video, the typical boomer might own their home, getting rid of their biggest expense, and might have $200,000 in retirement accounts, which bring in a monthly income of about $700. And when you add on Social Security or $2,000, the typical boomer might have $2,700 a month to live off of. And even with a paid-off home, that is not going to bring you a prosperous retirement. And to make matters worse, because boomers are having trouble finding work later in their careers, many are being forced to start taking on Social Security as early as age 62, which gives you about 70% of the full retirement amount, permanently giving you less money into retirement. And once again, late boomers were screwed. Because while early boomers were eligible for full Social Security at 65, many late boomers who turned 62 by 2022 didn't get full retirement until 67 and are getting even less money. And that is why so many boomers are retiring broke. And so let's finish this video off with Chapter 9, Where Do We Go From Here? As I said in the beginning of this video, although boomers as a generation have a lot of wealth, that statistic is very misleading because it's heavily concentrated. The top 10% hold 71% of the wealth, while the bottom 90% are left to split the remaining 29%. And when we look back at this story, it's clear why so many ended up with so little. They dealt with a changing retirement system, faced a life-changing recession, and didn't have enough time to recover. And so I want to finish this video off by sharing my 3 takeaways from this video. 1. Big numbers hide what most people are actually experiencing. The main inspiration behind making this video was learning that the top 10% of boomers hold 71% of the wealth. We often hear statistics and then come to very quick conclusions, like boomers are greedy and ruined it for everyone. But the truth is, numbers can be very misleading. Just because a group of people holds a lot of wealth doesn't mean the typical person of that group is wealthy. And I think the same can be said with a lot in this world. 2, not all wealth is created equal. Oftentimes we view wealth as money that is sitting in a vault, available whenever we need it. But not all wealth is created equal. As we uncovered in this video, although the typical boomer has a net worth of $387,000, most of that money isn't helping them much in day-to-day retirement. And I think that when it comes to building wealth in our own lives, it's important to diversify your investments and make sure that it's not all tied up in assets and unusable. And finally, timing matters more than we like to admit. Oftentimes we like to attribute success and outcomes to hard work and perseverance. And although there's a lot of truth to that, it's also important to recognize that a huge portion of people's success boils down to timing. And when it comes to your retirement, a lot of your success will be attributed to whether the system held through, what the economy looked like, and when you experienced a major financial event. The things that impact us the most are often the things that are out of our control. Thank you so much for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a like. Subscribe to my channel for more. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comment section. And if you want to hear another very interesting story about why 2 incomes made the middle class poorer than 1, give this video a watch next. And with that, muchas gracias. Que tenga un buen día. Nos vemos, chicos.